Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from people who found themselves alone on empty highways, stretches of road where the nearest town is an hour behind you. Your phone signal died somewhere around mile marker 40, and the headlights only push so far into the dark. These are accounts from drivers, truckers, and travelers who saw things on those empty roads that they were never meant to see. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if these stories keep you up tonight, good. That means they're working. Story 1. There's a stretch of highway in the high desert of eastern Nevada that I used to drive every other month for work. Route 93, somewhere between Ely and Wells. If you've never been out there, I don't know how to explain the emptiness to you. It's not like the empty you feel in a quiet neighborhood at night. It's geological, like the land itself has been vacant for so long that it forgot it was supposed to have people on it. The sky is enormous out there. Stars so thick in certain spots that the Milky Way looks like smoke. I used to love that drive. I'd load up a thermos of coffee, pick a long podcast, and just cruise. There was something meditative about it. I was 31 when this happened. I'd been doing that route for almost 2 years by then, and I knew every gas station, every rest stop, every cattle guard that would rattle the undercarriage if I hit it wrong. The drive was mine, familiar. It was a Tuesday night, or maybe early Wednesday, actually. I'd left Ely late because a client meeting ran over, which I was irritated about because I prefer making that drive with daylight on at least one end. My truck was low on windshield washer fluid, and the low tire pressure light had been on for a week even though I'd filled all 4 tires, so I was already mildly annoyed with the world. I had a half-eaten bag of sunflower seeds on the passenger seat and a road atlas I kept there as a joke because I'd never once opened it. Small stuff. That's what I remember about the beginning of that drive. Just small, boring stuff. About an hour out of Ely, maybe around 1 a.m., I passed a car pulled over on the shoulder with its hazards going, which in itself fine, that happens. I slowed down a little, glanced over, and saw someone standing just behind the car. A person just standing there in the dark between the vehicle and the guardrail. I almost stopped. I genuinely debated it for about a mile. But it was late, and it was Nevada, and you hear things. I told myself whoever it was had already called someone, that they had a phone, that my stopping would just make the situation awkward. I kept driving. I probably got another 15 miles down the road before I started feeling wrong about leaving. Not morally wrong, more like that particular unease you get when you've walked away from something you were supposed to pay attention to. I turned around, drove back. Hazards were still going on the car, which was a beat-up white Civic, but there was no one there. I pulled up behind it, turned on my brights. The car was empty. No one on the shoulder, no one in the scrub beyond the guardrail, no one walking up ahead or behind. Just the desert and the hazards ticking. I sat there for a few minutes. I called out once, felt stupid doing it, but I did. Nothing. I figured whoever it was had gotten a ride from someone else. I started to pull back onto the highway. That's when I saw it in my rear view. Someone was walking toward my truck from behind, not from the direction of the Civic. From behind me, out of the open desert, from the direction I'd just been driving from, walking in the middle of the lane. The headlights of an oncoming vehicle, there wasn't one, the road was empty, would have lit them up, but in my taillights they were just a dark shape, upright, walking at a very calm, very even pace. The thing that made me feel sick about it wasn't the figure itself. It was the stride, too long. Each step covered ground like a person walking, but the proportions were wrong. The legs seemed to hinge too far up on the body, and when I watched the silhouette move, the arms were hanging almost completely still at the sides while the whole torso swayed with each step, like someone who had learned to walk by watching a video of it with the sound off. I left. I'm not going to pretend I made any careful decisions. I put the truck in drive and I went. I watched the figure in my mirror until the distance swallowed it. Here's the thing I still think about. When I got to the next rest stop, the one with the single sodium light and the pit toilet that smells like old decades, I got out to walk around and collect myself. My whole body was doing that jittery, over-caffeinated thing that isn't caffeine. I walked around the truck twice just looking at it. On the rear driver's side panel, right at about waist height, there were 4 parallel marks in the paint. Shallow, the kind that would take a key or a nail or something like a nail, dragged slow and deliberate. The road grime inside the scratches was still bright where it had been displaced. Recent, done within the last few hours at the outside. I hadn't parked anywhere near anyone that whole drive. There was nowhere out there to park near anyone. I sold that truck 8 months later. I told myself it was time for an upgrade. The marks were still there when I handed over the keys. Story 2. Growing up in rural western Montana, long drives were just part of life. It's not dramatic when I say that, it's just geography. The nearest grocery store from my parents' place was 40 minutes on a good day, and if you needed an ER, you were budgeting 2 hours minimum. My dad used to say the roads out here separate the people who really want to be here from the people who just think they do. I drove those highways so many times by the time I was a teenager that I could do them half asleep, which, looking back, was probably exactly the problem. The summer I turned 23, I was between jobs and staying back at my parents' place while I figured out my next move. I had a buddy, Torsten Breck, we'd been friends since middle school, who lived about 60 miles north. We'd get together once or twice a week, usually at his place, play cards, watch whatever, just kill time the way you do when you're 23 and not quite sure what you're supposed to be doing yet. That drive, Highway 2 up through the flats and then into the foothills, was so ingrained in me that I almost didn't need to be awake for it. One night in late July, I was driving home from Torsten's around midnight. It was humid for Montana, which isn't saying much, but I remember my shirt was sticking to the seat back. I'd eaten too much, we'd made burgers, and I'd had 2, which I always regret, and I had the window cracked and the radio on low. Some AM talk station out of Missoula. The host was doing call-in ghost stories because apparently it was a slow news night, which I thought was funny. I wasn't scared of ghost stories. I'd grown up with them. About 20 minutes into the drive, I came around a long bend and my headlights swept over something on the road ahead. I thought at first it was a deer, the way you always assume deer. But it didn't move like a deer. It didn't scatter. It was crouched in the center of the lane, both lanes. Actually, this was a 2-lane road, and as my lights hit it, it turned and looked at me, except it didn't look at me with its face. It looked at me with its back. I know how that sounds. I've said it to a few people and watched their faces do the thing, but that's the only way I can explain it. The thing was crouched with what I would call its spine toward me, but it rotated its head, just the head, a full 180 degrees. Smoothly. The way an owl does, but an owl is built for that, and this thing was not built like an owl. It was roughly the size of a person bent double, though the limbs didn't distribute the way limbs should. Its skin, what I could see in the headlights, was the off-white of old candles. I hit the brakes. I don't know why. You'd think the instinct would be to accelerate. I stopped maybe 30 feet from it, and we just, I don't have another word for it, looked at each other. That head facing backward watching me, the body never moved, just that head still rotating slightly like it was calibrating. I laid on the horn. That felt stupid the second I did it, but I didn't know what else to do. It unfolded. That's what it looked like someone had compressed it down into the crouch and now it was releasing. It stood up in a way that took much longer than it should have, and it was tall. Not giant, but tall the way that registers as wrong in your chest. And then it walked off the road to the left into a drainage ditch and was gone. I sat there with my foot on the brake for what was probably 2 minutes. The AM radio host was laughing at something a caller had said. I remember that. The laugh was very loud in the silence. I drove home. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the center line and I drove. The next day I went out to that spot in the daytime. I'm not sure what I was expecting. Tracks, maybe, or marks, or nothing. Nothing would have been fine. But there was something in the bottom of the drainage ditch where it had gone. A neat row of small stones, maybe a dozen of them, arranged in a line perpendicular to the road. Not a natural line, too even, too deliberate. Stones that had been placed. I stood there looking at them for a long time, and then I went back to my truck. Torsten doesn't know I saw those stones. I never told him that part. Story 3. I want to be upfront about something. I'm not the kind of person who rattles easily. I spent 6 years doing long-haul trucking before I moved back home to take over my uncle's hardware store, and in that time I drove through ice storms in Wyoming, brake failures on mountain grades, cattle on the interstate at 3 in the morning. I'm not built for panic. I'm built for getting through things and writing them up afterward in the incident log with a flat tone and moving on. So when I tell you about the stretch of I-70 in Kansas, the part west of Salina where the road goes so flat and straight that the curvature of the earth is a real thing you can think about, I want you to understand that my hands were shaking when I got to the truck stop. My hands don't shake. They didn't shake during the brake failure. They didn't shake during the ice storm in Laramie, but they shook then. I was hauling a refrigerated load of produce out of Denver heading east. Late October, which means dark by 6 and the temperature dropping fast enough that you could track it by the half hour. I'd stopped for fuel and a bad slice of pizza somewhere around Russell, so it was probably 9 when I hit the truly flat part of the drive, the part where you turn off your brain and just exist inside the cab for a while. It was the lights that I noticed first. Far back in my mirrors, maybe a half mile, headlights. I didn't think much of it. There's always someone out there. But the thing about that stretch of road at night is that you can track a car's relative distance very accurately. The grade is so slight, the road so straight, that the physics of overtaking is almost mathematical. A car doing 75 was going to creep up on me doing 65 at a specific, predictable rate. These lights weren't doing that. They were maintaining distance, exactly maintaining it. I sped up slightly, and the lights stayed at the same remove. I eased off same distance. I did this 3 or 4 times over about 20 minutes. Someone on cruise control who happened to set it to exactly whatever I was running. Fine, that happens. Then the lights went off, not pulled over, not turned a direction. They simply extinguished mid-stretch of highway, and I was alone in my mirrors. I waited for them to come back. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. I changed the radio station, drank the last cold inch of gas station coffee, told myself it was nothing. Around mile marker 230, I heard a sound on the side of the trailer, not the wind. The wind on a trailer has a voice I know very well, a low constant pressure noise with occasional variation. This was different. This was rhythmic, a knocking, not loud, deliberate, like knuckles on a door. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause at highway speed. I was doing 68 miles an hour. I got on the CB, asked if anyone was behind me on 70 west of Salina. A driver I'd never met, going by the handle Copperhead, came back and said he was about 4 miles back and there was nothing between us. I asked him to confirm. He confirmed, just me and him out there. The knocking continued for, I want to say, 12 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock in a way that I don't usually watch clocks. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, and I drove until it stopped. At the truck stop in Salina, I got out and walked the length of the trailer. Nothing was loose, nothing was damaged. The refrigeration unit was running fine. I walked it twice with my flashlight. On the passenger side of the trailer near the back, at about the height a tall person could reach from road level. If a tall person were somehow standing at road level on a highway doing 68 miles per hour, there were 3 distinct indentations in the aluminum paneling. Not random dings from road debris. 3 neat, equally spaced oval dents, each about the size of a large fist, punched slightly inward. I've hauled that route twice more since. both times in daylight. I don't drive it at night anymore. The dispatcher thinks I'm superstitious. I've let him think that. Story 4. My grandmother always said the old highway, the original two-lane that ran parallel to the interstate before they bypassed the county, was a road you only drove if you had good reasons and bad options. She wasn't a superstitious woman, generally. She was the kind of grandmother who kept a running grocery list magnetized to the refrigerator and had strong opinions about correct pencil grip. So when she said something like that, I didn't dismiss it. I just filed it away as one of her more colorful expressions. The old highway in question runs through a corner of the Ozarks in southern Missouri. I grew up about 10 miles from it. It still technically exists. It's maintained, it's legal, it's just not convenient. It saves maybe 4 minutes on a drive that nobody's in a hurry to make anyway. The county road that runs along the ridge is prettier and makes more intuitive sense. Nobody takes the old highway unless they miss the turn, or they're local, or both. I was 28, driving back to my apartment in Joplin after Thanksgiving at my parents' place. It was late, later than I'd planned, because dinner had gone long and my sister's kids had wanted me to watch a movie before I left, and I can never say no to those kids. My car at the time was a 2009 Honda Accord that burned a little oil and had a passenger side mirror I'd zip-tied in place after a parking garage incident I'd rather not discuss. I had a travel mug of decaf. My mom had switched me to decaf a year earlier after I mentioned my sleep was bad, and I'd just sort of gone along with it, which means I was driving at 10 at night on nothing, and I missed my turn for the county road. I didn't realize I was on the old highway until I'd been on it for about 10 minutes. There are no lights out there. The road is narrower than modern roads, built in a time when cars were narrower and the trees pressing close on both sides. I recognized it from the way my headlights hit the old asphalt, slightly different color, slightly different texture, with those tar-patched cracks you don't see on maintained roads. I could have turned around. There are pull-offs. Instead, I just kept going because it was late and I was tired and 4 minutes felt worth something. The first thing I noticed, and I noticed this without it registering as a problem, was that the trees looked wrong on the left side of the road. I don't mean wrong in a supernatural sense. I mean they looked different from the trees on the right and from what I remembered of the trees flanking the county road. The right side was standard Missouri hardwoods, oak and hickory, the kind of forest that looks solid and deep and healthy. The left side trees were thinner, pale-barked. I thought maybe they were birch. There's birch in Missouri, though it's not common out here. I noted it and kept driving. The second thing was the smell. It came in through my vents as a smell almost like, I keep describing it as wet copper, which doesn't make sense as a smell, but that's the closest word. Not blood, not exactly, more like the inside of a very old well. I turned the vents off. About 3 miles in, my headlights landed on something in the road ahead that took me a moment to parse. I slowed automatically. It looked from a distance like a pile of clothes in the center of the lane. A coat, maybe, or a duffel bag that had fallen from a truck. I was 50 feet away before I understood that it was a person. They were lying face down in the road, completely still. Arms at their sides, not splayed the way someone would fall, but placed, exact, like they'd been arranged there. I stopped and sat behind the wheel for a long moment. My hazards were going. In that strobing orange light, the person, the figure, did not move. I rolled my window down. I called out, asking if they were okay. The woods on both sides absorbed the sound in a way that felt immediate, like the question never made it very far. I was weighing calling 911 when I noticed something that pushed everything else out of my mind. The figure was breathing. I could see it from the car, the slight rise and fall of the back, regular and slow, not the rapid breath of someone in distress, calm like sleep, but the placement of the arms so deliberately at the sides, the absolute stillness of everything else. And then the thing I can barely explain, the pale trees on the left had leaned, not been blown by wind, leaned, like their trunks had angled toward the road. Three of them bent at the base toward the figure lying in the road, as though drawn or tethered. I reversed. I don't know how long I drove backward before I was able to get turned around, and I'm not going to speculate about whether the figure moved while I was doing that because I refused to look. I took the long way to Joplin and got in at nearly 2 in the morning. In the morning, I found a smear of something dark on my driver's side window on the outside. I had not stopped the car. I had not rolled the window more than 6 inches. Whatever left, it would have had to have reached through a 6-inch gap to touch the glass from the inside, or have touched it from the outside while I was driving. The smear was in the shape of 3 fingers, dragged slowly from top to bottom. I cleaned it off with a gas station squeegee and did not look at it more than I had to. I haven't taken that highway since. I don't think I'd find it the same way twice anyway. Story 5. The summer I was 19, I worked a flagging crew on a highway resurfacing project out in eastern Oregon. This was my 2nd season doing it. The pay was good for someone without a degree, and I liked the physical simplicity of standing in the sun and holding a sign and telling people when to go. My crew chief was a woman named Delphine Acosta, who had been doing road work for 20 years and had opinions about everything and was usually right, which I appreciated. There were 5 of us total. Me, Delphine, a guy named Marcus Webb who was saving up for culinary school, and 2 brothers whose names I never fully got straight because everyone just called them the Odell Boys. The stretch we were working was a 2-lane highway through high desert and sage, not exactly a scenic destination, but remote in a way that made the silence feel deliberate. We'd set up a work zone about 4 miles from the nearest town in either direction. Our temporary traffic control signs were out a 1/4 mile each way. In the middle of the day, we'd see maybe 8 cars an hour. By dusk, it was closer to 1 or 2. By the time we wrapped up each night and drove the equipment back to the staging area, the road was essentially ours. The job was supposed to take 3 weeks. 3rd week in, we were ahead of schedule, which put Delphine in a good mood. She started bringing pastries from the gas station in town each morning, the kind with icing that was aggressively artificial. Marcus had started a running joke about what the icing was actually made of. Nobody on the crew was unhappy. It was, as jobs go, fine. The strange part started small. One morning, the week before we finished, I arrived at the staging area before anyone else and found that the equipment, specifically the static barricades we stacked at the end of each shift, had been moved. Not dramatically, 6 feet, maybe 8. They were still in the staging area, still organized, just shifted from where we'd left them. I spent about 30 seconds trying to figure out if I'd miscounted steps from the trucks or something. Couldn't make it work. When Delphine arrived, I mentioned it. She looked at the barricades for a long moment and then said, "Elk, probably." I said I didn't think elk moved traffic barricades in organized stacks. She said, "Probably not, but I'd rather say elk." I remember that. I'd rather say elk. 2 nights later, I was the last one at the site, doing a walk check before we cleared our equipment for the night. The rest of the crew had gone ahead to the staging area. The sun had been down for about 40 minutes and I had a headlamp, and I was walking the line of temporary lane markings to confirm they were set correctly for overnight. Halfway through the walk, I heard a voice, coming from the low scrub off the right shoulder, maybe 30 feet from the road edge. It was my mother's voice. Not someone who sounded like my mother, her voice. The specific cadence of how she says my name. I grew up hearing her call me in from outside, and there's a version of it, the I mean it version, that I would recognize in any context, in any noise. This was that version. I stood completely still. My headlamp lit the road in front of me and I did not move it toward the scrub. I can tell you exactly why. I was afraid of what I might see. I was more afraid of seeing than of not seeing, which I think tells you something about what I felt in the rest of my body in that moment. The voice said my name again, same inflection, same version. My mother was at home 400 miles away. I had talked to her 3 days earlier about whether I was eating enough. She had been in her kitchen when we spoke. I could hear the television behind her. I walked back to the vehicles. Not running, I want to be clear about this, but walking at a pace that was everything I had. I did not look toward the scrub. I got in the work truck and I drove to the staging area, and I sat there until Marcus came out and asked why I was parked funny. The next morning, I found a single flagging stake driven into the ground at the shoulder of the road, exactly where I'd been standing when I heard the voice. We had not placed that stake there. It wasn't ours. It was a different brand than we used, a slightly different orange, driven deep and straight, like someone had done it slowly and carefully. Delphine looked at it for a long time before she pulled it up. She didn't say elk this time. She just carried it to the equipment trailer and put it inside and didn't bring it up again. I called my mom that night. She was fine. She hadn't called me. She hadn't been thinking of me particularly, she said, just a regular day. Story 6. For most of my 20s, I thought the stretch of highway my dad called the Long Dark was just his dramatic way of describing the 40-mile run of US 191 in northern Montana that passes through the Blackfeet Reservation and the border of the National Forest without a single gas station or paved turnoff. He called it that with affection, like it was an old acquaintance. He'd driven it his whole life. He knew every pullout, every drainage, every place the road dipped and the ice would form first in October. My dad passed when I was 27. Heart, sudden, nothing predictable about it. I drove the Long Dark maybe 3 weeks after the funeral, taking his truck back up to my aunt's place in Browning because she'd asked for it. It felt like the right thing to do, get behind the wheel of his truck and drive his road one time, a kind of deliberate grief I'd read about but never practiced. My sister Vivienne thought I should wait. I told her I was fine. I wasn't fine, but I was functional, which felt close enough. I left before sunrise because I wanted to hit the Long Dark section around dawn, which is how my dad always preferred it. He said the light on the mountains at first sun made the drive feel like a gift. I had his travel mug in the cup holder. I'd washed it, but it still smelled faintly like the particular coffee he'd always bought, the one in the plaid can. The truck cab smelled like him in the general way that cars hold people's smells, which I'd expected but hadn't fully prepared for. The drive was fine until the Long Dark, which sounds like I'm setting something up, and I guess I am, but for the first 2 hours it genuinely was just driving. The mountains were doing what my dad said they'd do. The coffee was bad but familiar. I was sad in a settled way. Then, somewhere around mile 40 of the Long Dark section, something stepped out of the tree line ahead of me. It came from the right, and I thought at first, as you do, you always do, dear, but it didn't cross the road. It stopped in the center lane, and it turned. What I saw in my headlights was this, a figure that was almost the height of a man but proportioned differently. The torso was longer than the legs. The neck was longer than the torso. The head was small, and it sat on that neck at an angle that I can only describe as quizzical, tilted too far to one side, past what a comfortable tilt looks like. The arms hung at a length that would have put the hands past mid-thigh on a person, but on this thing they ended below where the knees would be. The light from my headlights hit it, and it showed me its face. I wish I could tell you what I saw there. I've tried to hold on to the image, and it keeps slipping, not out of trauma, I think, but because what I saw simply didn't organize into features the way a face should. There were structures in the right places, but they didn't mean what they were supposed to mean. It was like looking at a language you don't speak. All the letters are there, but none of it resolves. I came to a full stop. The figure stood and looked at me, if looking is what it was doing, for several seconds, and then it raised one of those two long arms, not aggressively. Just raised it, hand at shoulder height, in a gesture that I cannot honestly describe as anything other than a wave. Then it stepped off the road to the left and was gone. I sat in my dad's truck on the long dock for a few minutes with my hands in my lap. The engine idled. I picked up the travel mug and held it for a while without drinking. Here is what I have never fully worked out. When I got to my aunt's place and told her what had happened, not mentioning my dad, not mentioning the grief, just describing the figure, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father saw something on that road once. Years ago, he never described it to me exactly, but he said it waved. I don't know what to do with that. I've thought about it almost every day for 5 years, and I still don't know." Story 7. I drove for a rideshare company for 2 years, which means I've spent a lot of time on roads that decent people are off of by midnight. The late shifts, the ones the other drivers pick up reluctantly, the ones that pay the surge rates because demand spikes when the bars close, those were my specialty. I didn't mind the hours. I'd been an insomniac since high school, and having a reason to be awake at 3 in the morning felt better than lying in my apartment staring at the ceiling. My car at the time was a silver Hyundai Sonata that I detailed myself every 2 weeks because reviews matter, and I kept a box of mints and a phone charger in the back seat, and I had a 4.9 rating, and I was proud of that. This was in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest. I don't want to name it for reasons I'll get to. The specific incident happened on a road that runs from the eastern suburbs out into what I'd call the approach to wilderness, not forest yet, but the last few miles of residential and commercial that give way to it. The road is called Pembroke Connector locally, though I'm not sure it has an official name. It's about 9 miles long, and it's used mostly by people who live out past the city edge and commute in, plus a few hikers accessing trailheads at the far end. The fare that night came in around 1:40 a.m. Destination was an address near one of the trailhead parking areas, which was strange. Who gets dropped at a trailhead at that hour, but not my business. The passenger was a woman who sat in the back, earbuds in, and said nothing the entire ride, which is fine. Better, honestly. Some of my best fares were the silent ones. I dropped her at the address, confirmed the drop with the app, and headed back down Pembroke. It's a straight shot. No reason to think about it. I'd driven it maybe 40 times. About 2 miles from the drop point, I noticed something on the shoulder. I thought it was a runner at first. There are people who run at night, I've seen them. But it wasn't moving at running pace. It was moving at a walk, and it was on the wrong side of the road for a runner following standard road safety practice, which sounds like a weird thing to notice, but when you drive as much as I did, you notice that stuff automatically. I slowed slightly as I passed. My headlights lit up a man. I'd say his age was impossible to estimate, which is itself an odd thing to think, but his face was wrong for giving you an age estimate. He was walking with his hands at his sides and his face angled slightly upward, not looking at the road, looking at the sky essentially while walking. I passed him, checked my mirror. He wasn't there. I want to be careful about how I say this. A person who was there 5 seconds ago was not there when I looked in my mirror. The road behind me was straight and empty for as far as my taillights reached. There was nowhere to go, no turnoff, no driveway, no gap in the vegetation. He was simply not there. I slowed, kept watching the mirror, nothing. I kept driving, doing the thing where you explain things to yourself. He dropped into a ditch. He ducked behind a tree. He'd been a weird trick of my headlights in the first place, fatigue creating a human shape from shadows. I'd been driving for 7 hours. This was the kind of thing tired eyes did. I got about a mile further before the notification appeared in my app, a new ride request. The pin was behind me, back toward where I just passed the man walking. The name on the account was a string of characters that the app shouldn't have allowed. Not letters, not numbers, just a sequence of symbols that I can still see when I close my eyes and probably shouldn't try to describe here. I rejected the fare and I drove home, and I sat in my parked car in my parking structure for 20 minutes before I went inside. In the morning, I reported the account to the platform as a technical issue. I don't know what they did with that information. The thing I keep coming back to, my passenger side window was fogged when I got home, despite the heater having been on. There was something in the fog. A shape had been drawn in it from the outside while the car was moving. It was a spiral, small and neat, in the center of the glass. I took a photo before I wiped it off. I don't show people the photo. Story 8. There are roads in the Texas Hill Country that will take you an hour in any direction before you hit a town worth naming. I know this because my family's land is out there, 300 acres of cedar and limestone that my grandparents held onto through a lot of hard decades, and that passed to my father and then to me and my brother Cade. The land's not particularly useful. Too rocky for agriculture, too far from town for development. We keep it because we keep it. Family math. I'm a school teacher. Was at the time of this. I'm 34 now, and this happened 2 years ago during the summer between semesters when I drove out to the property to deal with a fence line that a cedar tree had fallen across during a late spring storm. It was the kind of maintenance job that nobody wants to do, but that keeps piling up until the fence fails and your neighbor's cattle are in your pasture. I've been putting it off for 6 weeks. I drove out on a Thursday morning. Mid-June in the hill country is hot but bearable in the early hours, and I had a playlist going and a bag of pork rinds, and I was genuinely in a decent mood about the whole thing. The highway from town to the property is about 42 miles, and the last 12 of those are on a county road that sees maybe 20 cars a day on a busy weekend. I know the landmarks. The rusted grain bin at the Pelletier family driveway, the place where a tributary creek runs under the road and you can hear it when you slow down, the fence post with the old glass insulator my grandfather put there 70 years ago that nobody has touched since. The glass insulator was gone. I almost didn't stop for it. It's such a small thing. But I'd been seeing that insulator my whole life, and its absence was disorienting enough that I pulled over and got out and looked. The post was there. The wire was there. Even the staple that had held the insulator to the post was there. But the insulator, the old pale green glass one that would have been there since before I was born, was gone. I stood there in the mid-morning heat for longer than the situation warranted. Then I got back in my truck and drove to the property. The fence job took most of the morning and part of the afternoon. Nothing notable. Cedar is dense and stubborn, and the tree had dragged the fence down over a 30-foot run, and it took me longer than I wanted. By the time I was finished, it was close to 4. I drove back out the way I came, planning to be home by 6. The county road at that hour on a Thursday is empty. The heat sits on the cedar and the limestone, and the road shimmers in ways that can make you second-guess your distance perception. I had all the windows down because the truck's AC had been underperforming in the heat, and the smell of the cedar and the dust was actually pleasant. I was tired in a satisfying way. About 6 miles from the highway junction, I saw something on the road ahead. I thought it was a coyote, then I thought it was a dog, then as I got closer I understood it was neither. It was crouched at the center line, low to the ground, and it was eating something. My headlights, the afternoon sun doesn't do what headlights do, but it lit the scene cleanly, showed me a shape that was long across the back and narrow through the shoulders, and was using both arms rhythmically as it fed. I stopped. From about 70 feet I watched it. It was working at something on the road surface, and the motion was deliberate and focused and completely indifferent to my truck sitting stopped on the road in front of it. Its back was to me. The texture of its skin, what I could see above the low crouch, was wrong in a way that took me a moment to name. It was the texture of skin that has been wet for a long time. Pale and loose-looking, slight movement independent of the body beneath it, the way very wet leather moves. Then it stopped feeding, the back went still. The head turned not a human amount, but enough to see me from the corner of whatever it was using instead of an eye socket, and I saw in that partial profile that its jaw was working in a way that jaws don't work, not chewing, opening and closing laterally like scissors cutting air. I put the truck in reverse and backed up to a wide spot in the road and turned around and drove back to the property. I waited there until it was almost full dark. When I drove out again, the road was clear. There was a dark stain on the asphalt at roughly the right spot, not large, maybe 18 inches across. The shape of it meant nothing. I kept driving. Back home, going through my gear, I found the glass insulator in the bed of my truck, just sitting there in the bed near the tailgate. Green glass, old, exactly the one from my grandfather's fence post. Sitting in my truck bed, which I had not put it in, which had been gate down at the property while I worked the fence. It's in my house now, on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe because it's the only part of the whole day I can hold in my hands. Story 9. My partner Saoirse always says I have a problem with pride, and I think she's right. And I think the reason I ended up alone on Route 50 in central Nevada at 2 in the morning with a blown tire and no cell signal is directly traceable to that character flaw. I could have flown. The conference was in Sacramento, the tickets were cheap. There was no good reason to drive except that I had just purchased a new car, a charcoal gray Subaru Legacy that still had that smell, and I wanted to take it somewhere significant for its first long trip. 3 months old, under 8,000 miles on it. I wanted the open road experience. For the record, the open road is beautiful. I stand by that. US 50 through Nevada, which they used to call the loneliest road in America, earns that name during the day in a way that's legitimately moving. Great flat valleys between mountain ranges, ghost town ruins, the light doing things with distance that I normally only see in paintings. I stopped at a rest area and ate trail mix and took pictures of the nothing with my phone and felt good about the decision. That was in the daylight. The tire blew around 1:30 a.m., not a slow leak, a sudden catastrophic pop that pulled the car hard right and took me about 100 yards of heart-pounding correction to bring to the shoulder. I sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel just breathing. The spare was in the trunk. I knew how to change a tire. There was no signal, but that was fine because I didn't need one. I had what I needed. I got the jack and the spare and the wrench. I set up the flares, I had 3, and I put them out properly behind the car. I started working on the lug nuts. The first 2 came fine. The third one was seized, which happens, and I was working it with the extender and really putting my weight on it when I became aware that something was standing at the edge of the road. Just standing. In the dark beyond, where my flares reached. Not moving. I couldn't make out details. The flares threw orange light in a limited radius and this was past it. A shape, human height, not moving. I said hello and immediately felt ridiculous about it, the way you do when you shout into the dark and hear your own voice come back sheepish and small. Nothing answered. I went back to the lug nut. The thing I remember clearly is that I made a choice to keep working, which is its own kind of information about where my head was. The pride my partner talks about. I had a job to do and I was going to do it, standing figure or no standing figure. The lug nut broke free. The other 2 came fast. I pulled the flat, put the spare on, started the nuts back by hand. The shape had moved. It was closer to the flare line now. I hadn't heard footsteps, and the desert out there is not quiet. The wind makes a low, constant noise through the sage, but it had moved. Maybe 30 feet closer, still just standing. The flare light was reaching it enough now that I could confirm it was upright, and the proportions at this distance in this light seemed right. Ordinary, a person just standing. I picked up the wrench. I'm not a confrontational person. I want to be clear about that before I tell you the next part. I said loudly that I was almost done and I'd be out of the way in 5 minutes and that I wasn't interested in any trouble. This sounds absurd written out, I know that, but in the moment it felt like the most rational thing available. The figure sat down, not fell, not crouched, sat slowly and with what looked like deliberate ease, the way you'd sit down on a chair, cross-legged on the desert floor 20 feet from the flare. Just sat there. I finished tightening the lug nuts as fast as I could. I loaded the equipment into the trunk without looking at the sitting figure more than twice. I got in the car. When I drove past the spot where it had been sitting, my headlights lit the ground and there was nothing there. Driving on, windows up, I noticed a smell in the car that hadn't been there before. Strong, something between sulfur and turned meat. I drove with the windows down despite the cold for the rest of the night. When I reached Sacramento and parked at the hotel, I found that all 3 of my exterior mirrors had been rotated, all 3 on both sides, and the center rear view repositioned to face down toward the road surface. Not wildly, not broken, adjusted, carefully turned to point at the ground. I put them back and I never told Saoirse. She'd say it was about pride, and honestly, she would not be wrong. Story 10. I want to say this clearly at the beginning. I've thought about whether I should tell this story to anyone for about 3 years. Not because I don't believe what I saw, I believe it completely. But there's a particular kind of dismissal that happens when you're a woman in her 40s who drives alone for a living and you start talking about things on dark roads. People decide you were tired or afraid or both. I was neither. I've been a field biologist for 16 years. I have spent more nights in remote places than most people will in their entire lives. I know what animals sound like, I know what people look like, and I know the difference between my own brain and what is actually in front of me. What I saw on Highway 212 in the high prairie of eastern Montana was not a product of fatigue, and I am telling you this story precisely because I want it recorded somewhere that it existed. I'd been doing a weeks-long survey of grassland bird populations along a transect that ran east-west through a stretch of land that's mostly private ranches and BLM ground. My field vehicle, a white Toyota 4Runner that had about 200,000 miles on it, and a busted radio that I'd been meaning to get fixed since the previous October, was set up with all my gear in the back, sleeping bag, cooler, sampling equipment. The laminated species lists from 3 different survey protocols. I was driving back toward the town where I'd booked a motel room for the night, which was a little under 2 hours away. The date was sometime in early September. The time was around 10:30 or 11. I was listening to a podcast about Pleistocene megafauna, which is the kind of thing I find relaxing. The highway was empty in both directions as far as I could see, which on that section of 212 means miles in each direction. The sky was clear and the stars were intense in a way you only get in places with no light competition, and I remember noticing a satellite track from east to west and watching it for a few seconds before bringing my eyes back to the road. On the road ahead, something was happening to the surface. I need to describe this carefully because it sounds wrong when I say it plainly. The road was moving, not the road itself, but the surface of it. A ripple the way pavement looks on a very hot day when the heat rises off it in visible waves, except it was night and the temperature had dropped to the mid-40s. The ripple was localized, covering a roughly circular area maybe 20 feet across, centered in my lane about 300 feet ahead. It was doing something that heat mirage doesn't do. It was stable, not flickering. A consistent, smooth distortion of the road surface, like the asphalt was breathing. I slowed. I'm a scientist. I slowed because I wanted to observe, not because I was afraid, though the observing and the being afraid were beginning to occur simultaneously. At about 150 feet from it, things became clear in a way that made the observing harder. The center of the distortion was a slight elevation, not large, maybe 4 inches off the surface, and from this elevation things were extending, not in a dramatic way, slowly and low to the ground. What I can only describe as tendrils, though they weren't tentacles. They were flat, smooth, the color of old asphalt, and they were moving across the road surface in multiple directions simultaneously. Each one was maybe 2 inches wide. They moved the way shadows move across a floor when a light source swings slowly overhead, but they had mass and texture. I stopped the vehicle. In my headlights, what I was looking at resolved into something I still cannot classify. The central elevation was the apex of something larger that was mostly beneath the road surface, or behaving as though the road surface were a membrane it was pressing up through. The tendrils, branches, extensions, whatever they were, had spread across both lanes and several feet onto each shoulder. The nearest one was about 40 feet from my front bumper. I sat there for what my field instincts told me was probably 4 minutes, though the clock later told me it had been 22. The thing, the whatever it was, receded. Slowly, the tendrils withdrew. The central elevation diminished. The ripple effect faded. The road surface was ordinary pavement again. I got out and I walked to the spot with my headlamp. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't shaking. I was shaking. But I got out and I walked to the spot because that is what you do, or what I do, because what is the point of observing if you stop observing when it gets difficult? The asphalt was undisturbed in any way I could detect visually. I touched it, which in retrospect was not sensible. It was cool, ordinary, the texture of any road. In my headlamp, I walked a slow circle around the perimeter of where the disturbance had been. At the edge on the south shoulder, I found an impression, one impression, round about 9 inches across, the depth of a thumbprint in the road surface. Not freshly made, the edges were weathered, as though it had been there for seasons, but it was exactly where I had watched the perimeter of the disturbance end. I photographed it with my field camera. I have the photograph. I've shown it to 2 colleagues and they've described it separately as a stress fracture consistent with freeze-thaw cycles, which is entirely possible. That is entirely possible. I drove to the motel. I wrote my field notes. I did not write about what I had seen because my field notes are professional documents, and what I had seen was not in my sample protocol. I've been back to that stretch of 212 twice. Both times during the day. The impression is still there both times I checked. I don't drive 212 at night anymore. I've found a longer route that adds 40 minutes, and when my colleagues ask why I take it, I say it's the scenery. They believe me. The scenery out there really is remarkable. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you up, hit that like button and subscribe for more highway horror coming every week. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most. I'm especially curious whether it was the thing on Route 50 or the road out in Montana, because those two felt different from the others when I was putting this together. Share this with someone who thinks they're brave enough to drive alone at night. Until then, keep your mirrors adjusted, your doors locked, and if something on the road raises its hand at you, don't wave back.